The newsfeed late night. Thanks for staying on. Reporting continues now. And as we continue looking at the policing in the country, what standards should be set to prevent police or law enforcement brutality, independent researcher specializing in policing, crime and public security, David Bruce, joins me now to talk further to this issue. David, good evening and thank you very much for your time tonight here on the newsfeed late night. So if we look at the report of the military ombud in the matter of Collins Khoza, the ombud finds that in fact, he recommends that appropriate disciplinary measures be taken against the commander of the platoon who was on the ground against those who were within his command as well. Should be looking at it. This speaks to a question of accountability at a leadership level, would you say?
Certainly, that's right. So I actually wasn't aware of that, but it's one of the issues of accountability that you know in relation to which there are always questions when one does have these incidents is to what degree this reflects shortcomings in the exercise of systems of command.
Do we have what you would call an organizational template that shows those systems of command, but also that ensure that in those command structures, human rights compliance is prioritized? Right.
Well, I mean, the one interesting thing to look at is obviously the SAPS. I mean, when we're talking about the death of Collins Khoza, we're obviously talking about someone who, from what we know, was killed by members of the SANDF. But the one organization that we should look to provide standards around, you know, this kind of issue, firstly in relation to questions about how force is used, but also in relation to questions of the accountability when force is misused, is the South African Police Service. And you know, I think basically the answer to your question is that the SAPS could not be seen by any means as providing a model for how these kinds of situations should be dealt with. Firstly, in terms of setting clear standards for its members in relation to how they use force, but then also on these questions about accountability, including the accountability of members who were allegedly involved and their commanders.
Yeah. The question of suspensions or leave with full pay or without pay also comes into a question here, as I suppose, again, whether it's a carrot or a stick type of approach. I mean, how do you think that should be handled, particularly when a criminal investigation is currently undergoing? I mean, it was argued extensively during the court case that was at the High Court whether or not they should be suspended with full pay. But I suppose standard procedure right now is that whenever you're suspended while investigation ensues, you are being paid fully.
Yes, that's right. I mean, as far as I understand, there are instances where there is some level of discretion as to whether the suspension is a suspension on full pay. But I could easily be wrong about that. But I think that you know, part of the problem here is that these processes often seem to take an extraordinarily long time to unfold. So, I mean, one might, you know, take this, you know, opportunity to compare ourselves with what's happening in the U.S. at the moment, where, you know, in respect of the killing of George Floyd, at least, who was killed at the end of May last year, there is now a trial unfolding for at least the principal police officer who is allegedly implicated in his death. But, you know, in South Africa, typically these processes often take longer than that. And so I think one of the conflicts has been that one was having a larger and larger number of people suspended without pay. And I know that in the case of the SAPS itself, the policy now is in effect that a person cannot be suspended for longer than 3 months. And so it seems very clear that in these situations, a person should be suspended, but then one might have a situation. So one has, in fact, had situations quite recently where, for instance, Richard Mdluli, who was accused of a number of things, including corruption, spent 6 years on suspension. But ideally, one I think would want people to be suspended, but one would also want these processes to be dealt with in a reasonably expeditious manner, so that they, the period of time that they spend on suspension, with usually with pay, does not drag on indefinitely.
Now, of course, we are talking a lot about the skilling of police officers, so the skill in policing itself. And now you mentioned the George Floyd situation, and I have kind of been watching a little bit of that trial and what is coming out of there, and the processes that are being followed, for example, in that system of policing. There's also a sense that we need to capacitate our policing with policies, for example, around the use of force and how that is being reported, but also how that is being investigated. You know how, for example, in the Floyd matter, immediately a report had to be compiled. There's an officer who was responsible just to come and investigate the use of force in that particular matter. I don't know if we've got something like that in South Africa.
Yes, well, you're right to highlight the issue. In fact, what we've got in South Africa is the only provision within the SAPS itself is a requirement that when a firearm is discharged, then there's supposed to be an investigation. But a situation where a person is killed, where a firearm is not used, does not automatically lead to an internal investigation. Generally, the problem that we have at the moment is that, to some degree, what the SAPS itself does is use the existence of the SAPS to wash its hands of responsibility for dealing with, to use the existence of IPID, the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, to wash its hands of responsibility for dealing with these matters. And so you will have situations where, the evidence is even quite straightforward, that, a person has misused force or acted beyond their powers. But the SAPS will say, no, we cannot do anything. We have to wait for IPID to finalize its investigation.
Now, if you look at some of the skills that we're talking about here that are required at the magnitude at which they are required, particularly when it comes to handling big crowds and intense situations. We know our police are working, maybe even our soldiers are performing their tasks in continually risky situations. How easy or how difficult is it to get these skills, to learn these skills? It's something that can be readily learned?
Well, no, I think that essentially, many of the skills are skills which a police officer would, spend a career learning. They're not skills, for instance, the skills of how to manage a situation of confrontation or conflict with other people is something, it's not that there's a test that you can write and then you know how to deal with that. And so, ideally what you want to have is, an approach within an organization like the SAPS, where there's a continual emphasis on, drawing lessons from the interactions that members of the police service have with members of the public. And, the one thing that you would want to do then is, particularly where members of the police service have dealt with an incident in a successful way, you would want to, draw that attention to the attention of other members of the police service and so on. So, it's a problem because we tend to have a very legalistic kind of approach within the SAPS at the moment, where it's a matter of, telling people about the law and taking them to the shooting range. But basically, in order to have a police service which, it has members who are appropriately capacitated to deal with the difficult situations that they do deal with in many circumstances, one needs to take a much more type of proactive approach in terms of which it's, the processes of learning are built almost into the day-to-day management of the police.
David, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining us. Independent researcher specializing in policing, crime and public security, David Bruce. We continue.